I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey, what's up, everybody? Today, we're talking on the American Doom podcast with Max Flugrath of Fair Fight, voting rights organization here in Georgia. And we're going to talk about some of the controversy that's been going on with the state election board here, which has been manhandled and hijacked by three pro-Trump members, as well as the issue of ongoing voter purges and some lawsuits surrounding that that I think are probably alluding to a narrative to come about another stolen election that Trump and Republicans will claim happened. So stick around. Hey, Max, first off, thanks for taking the time to fill us in on some things today. Before we get into some of the in the weeds, gritty, insane details about stuff that's going on here in Georgia, give us an idea what Fair Fight, your organization, does in general, and what you guys are up to heading into November.
Absolutely. First, thanks for having me. Big fan of American Doom. The coverage y'all do is fantastic and very important. So as you said, Fair Fight, we are a pro-voter. We're a voting rights organization based in Georgia. And, on a 10,000 foot level, what we do is we fight for free and fair elections in Georgia and across the country in general. Ahead of November, we are working to do what we do almost every election year, which is make sure voters have the information they need to access the ballot in the easiest and most seamless way possible. We took an innovative approach to that actually this year. We launched a new AI voting assistant. So it's essentially a chatbot that's trained on all nonpartisan, verified election information so that, if voters have questions about how to register, when's the last day to register, where's their polling place, any election questions, they can go to peachvote.com and they can ask Peaches, who is this chatbot, like I mentioned, and it's actually pretty fun to use. She was created with sort of like a Southern charm voice. So,
Love it.
She'll say things to you like, bless your heart, darling. And, she'll tell you where your polling location is. Yeah. She's fantastic. And then one other initiative that we're really working on right now is our LFG volunteer initiative. It stands for Let's Freaking Go, or, you can use a different F word if you'd like. But what it does is it aims to engage voters in key battleground states where, like 2020 and so many other races, those margins will be the most crucial to deciding who wins the presidential election, as well as key Senate races that will likely decide control of the U.S. Senate.
Right. Wow, that sounds amazing. Sort of like a voting advocacy version of Clippy. Remember Clippy from like Microsoft Word, back in the day? Also, I love that you guys have utilized AI to help people figure out how to register to vote. While on the other side of the table, we've got Republicans and election deniers who utilize AI to create giant lists of voters that they say should be removed from voter rolls, which is something that we'll get into here in a little bit. But if it's all right with you, I want to move on to talking about the state election board stuff that's been happening here recently in Georgia. Just to catch people up, there are three pro-Trump members of the Georgia State Election Board. These are unelected officials. They're appointed basically by, Democrats or Republicans. They're appointed by political parties. And lately, they have really been on a roll here. It started a little bit before.
It's putting it nicely.
Yeah. It started a little bit before a Trump rally on August 3rd, where he shouted out these three of the five members of the state election board. They were already up to their eyeballs in trying to implement rules and policies and procedures and pursue investigations that were all being brought forth by hardcore election denial activists. But after Trump shouted them out on August 3rd, that's when things really got moving. And the two things that they've done that have probably gotten the most attention, and I think rightly so, is they have passed two rules that sort of allow for broader power for county election officials to refuse to certify election results based off of, what I think we could say is like their belief in election fraud and their pursuits of investigation related to it. So this all came to a head, last week, 2 weeks ago, when a former Democratic member of the Fulton County Board of Elections filed a complaint, what she called a formal complaint, to Governor Kemp, asking him to start administrative hearings to get these three members off the election board for a variety of things, not just that they are implementing rules that are potentially against Georgia law and are happening right now within 90 days of an election. So, and then on Friday, Chris Carr said basically like, oh, Kemp doesn't really have to remove them if he doesn't want to. Tell us about, from the Kathy Woolard complaint to where we stand now. Catch us up on that.
Yeah, so you provided a good summary, but you're absolutely right. A former elections official filed a detailed 9-page complaint, which laid out a myriad of charges against these members, from one of them seeking to get a job in a potential second Trump administration by talking to a key Trump ally, to their essentially, you say alleged, but it seems pretty concrete, their violation of Georgia's Open Meetings Act. They coordinated to hold a meeting to pass through rule changes to certification at a time when they knew the other two members could not attend.
Which they're being sued over. The American Oversight is suing them over that meeting. And yes, I think it's important to point out that they tried to pass one of these very controversial rules in that meeting where they knew that they would be the only voting members, present. Continue.
Correct. They essentially asked the other two members who would not agree with these rule changes, what their availability was on a certain day. Then they proceeded to essentially just start having a meeting at that time when they knew these folks weren't available. So a lot of issues there. The 9-page complaint goes through a lot of specific problems, lays it out, and it was filed with Governor Kemp in his capacity as the elected official who is supposed to deal with these things. After this complaint was filed, members of the Georgia House and the Georgia Senate, Democratic members, Democratic legislators, both sent similar letters separately to Governor Kemp, echoing these issues and asking that the governor look into this. While the Senate was actually having a press conference, kind of announcing that they were sending this letter, echoing these charges, kind of raising this issue, the governor actually passed the complaints over to the Attorney General, Chris Carr, asking him to provide guidance on whether or not the governor has authority under law to, hold hearings and remove these members.
Because just to clarify, I think, Kemp's rationale for that would be that, like, I believe that the three members in question were appointed by the legislature, whereas Kemp, the member that Kemp appointed, he only has one appointment on the board. He appointed John Furvier, who's the chair. He's a Republican. He's the former CEO of Waffle House. He's kind of like, I guess, a more moderate thing. So I guess that was potentially the rationale for Kemp asking the Attorney General, Chris Carr, hey, can I remove these people or what, right?
Yes, exactly. And, Georgia law is very specific on this. It does not matter who appointed these members. If they violated the law, if they violated the election board's code of ethics, the governor has the power to remove them.
Right.
And so, he sent this complaint over to the Attorney General, and right around the same time, he actually headlined a fundraiser here in Atlanta for Donald Trump with Mike Pompeo. So, there may be some political reasons as to why he is trying to slow walk this or trying not to take action. It's unclear, right? But you can't help but connect the dots.
Right. And then, so basically what happened, which by the way, the result of this, I found a little bit unexpected. I think that I, along with many people, thought that, like what you said, based off of your reading of the law, attorneys' readings of the law that I've spoken to, my reading of the law, that Carr was going to come back and just say, yeah, you've got, the power here, which he didn't really say you don't have the power to do this. What he said was he quibbled over whether or not the technicality of whether or not this was a formal complaint. Now, of course, in the letter where he says this maybe doesn't constitute a formal complaint, he never really says what would constitute a formal complaint. But you and I have talked about that and speculated a little bit about what that can look like. And, I wonder if you can tell me whether or not you think that complaint will come from members of the state legislature saying, hi, this is a formal complaint now from us. We would like you to think about removing these. I mean, isn't that going to be the next step here from Democrats?
Most likely so, right? It seems like the attorney general is playing a game. In his opinion, he recognizes there is no actual definition for a formal complaint under Georgia law.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he tries to say the complaints that were filed with Governor Kemp, one of which was 9 pages, very substantive and specific, and filed as a quote formal complaint.
Right.
He tries to say that those are not formal. So right. It's very odd. And, just the fact that he's likening detailed, well-founded complaints that has been filed with the governor to, inquiries and generalized grievances is pretty alarming.
Right.
Especially such a swift rejection, right? It leaves unanswered what level of complaint would be sufficient to trigger the governor's statutorial duty to hold the election board accountable. And, based on this opinion, it's almost difficult to imagine that any complaint could actually require the governor to act, which right. seems frankly unimaginable.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me, it's been a while since I've thought of this, but Georgia does not have the best ethics laws and rules when it comes to conflict of interest and things like that for elected officials. These aren't even elected officials, and it leads me to think about the nature of that quibbling over the inquiry about how the SEB works, which I want to get to next. But, first, I just want to point out, I thought I understood the political machinations of this for Kemp. Like, he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's trying to, appease the people who are calling for these pro-Trump SEB members to be removed by saying, okay, yeah, sure, I'll ask Carr about it and see what he says. But, does he think that, Democrats aren't stupid? The people who want these pro-Trump members of the SEB gone, we know that this opinion from Carr is really just like a bunch of smoke, right? So I guess I just don't see how this is along the lines of having his cake and eating it too, because essentially what he did was he just gave a huge gift to the hardcore election denial wing of the Georgia GOP by being like, well, my hands are tied. Chris Carr says I can't really do anything, which I don't really think was what he was trying to do here. I think he was trying to thread the needle and look like he's potentially going to crack down on these people while also keeping those pro-Trump bona fides going. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because now that we talk about it, I'm like, yeah, this doesn't really fully make sense to me anymore.
Yeah, it's a little odd, right? Governor Kemp gets a lot of credit for not breaking the law following 2020, the 2020 election, yep. when Trump tried to get, him and Secretary of State Raffensperger to go along with his illegal scheme.
Yep.
And, he should get credit for that. But at the same time, that's a very low bar.
Yeah.
We expect not only elected officials, but regular everyday citizens to not break the law. So right. That's that. But, in terms of this new situation, it is odd. I see Governor Kemp as someone who believes he will kind of outlive the MAGA movement in right. the Republican Party, potentially. So I think he's a very methodical, strategic thinker who is playing the long game here. But at the same time, I think it's in his best interest to take action to protect the independence of Georgia elections. Following the 2022 election and the runoff with Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, there was a mythical Kemp Warnock voter that the media was infatuated with for a little bit. And, it seems to me that Kemp would need the support of these folks if he wants to run for something like the U.S. Senate or even president in the future. So to be seen as caving to MAGA election sabotage muckery,
right.
In my opinion, doesn't necessarily bode well for him politically. So he's trying to toe that line as best as he can. But at what point do you let allow illegal and unethical behavior to continue and potentially impede the independence of an election?
Right. Yeah. And so, that let's talk about the public inquiry language from Carr's letter, which I also, so for folks who haven't read the letter, he essentially said, like, well, we can't just listen to every complaint that is brought to us about officials like those on the SEB and then initiate hearings and proceedings that would then remove those members, because then any Tom, Dick, or Harry in Georgia could file a complaint against somebody, and now we have to think about removing them. And of course, the obvious irony there is that the way that the SEB works, you could go on the SEB's website right now and says request an investigation. It doesn't have
I'm sure people are doing that right now.
It doesn't. They're always doing it. If you watch these meetings, if you pay attention to what is happening in these meetings and what the SEB does, virtually every investigation that they have undertaken in the past 4 years has come as a result, not even of a random citizen really requesting an investigation, of hardcore election denial activists requesting investigations over and over
That's
and
right.
over again. And like, you talked about the detailed and substantive letter that was sent by Kathy Woolard requesting Kemp to consider removal of these members. Look, there's plenty of detailed letters that are sent by election denial activists requesting the SEB to investigate. Are they substantive? No, because they're not really based in factual reality. But so I just wanted to point out, like, the irony, one of the biggest irony of Carr's letter here is that, like, oh, we can't just have anybody saying we need to investigate, when that is quite literally how the SEB operates, right?
Yeah, I guess so. He's taking, there's divergence there between whatever statutes, handle what the SEB does and whatever statutes now handle what the governor does. So I understand that, but, you make a really good point. And, even in the AG's opinion, which, was about 4 pages long, again, the election official complaint, the formal complaint filed, was 9 pages long. So it's more than twice as long as the AG's actual opinion. That shows how substantive, detailed, and methodical it is. But one detail that I think is interesting to point out in the opinion is the AG does briefly mention a 2012 court case here in Georgia called Roberts v. Deal. And that case actually supports that citizen-led complaints are sufficient to trigger the governor's legal duty to hold an administrative hearing on the election board members' recent misconduct.
Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, it was just such an obvious sidestepping of Kathy Woolard's complaint, because by doing this, the reason that Carr's letter only needed to be 4 pages long was because by sidestepping it with this technicality of what constitutes a formal complaint, he didn't have to address anything of the substantive facts of Kathy Woolard's letter, right? Like, he doesn't.
It's a strategic way to move the goalpost almost.
Right. Okay, so that's that. That's one bucket of the madness, right? And it's going to continue. But I want to talk and move a little bit on to.
Well, before we do that, can I just mention one other thing?
Sure.
It's very odd what they're trying to do with this whole formal complaint thing, and it's almost like if this opinion is saying that essentially, like, no complaint can be filed with the governor to actually make him take action, it almost suggests that, criminal charges would be required for the governor to act. And, such charges do appear warranted. As outlined in some of these complaints that have been filed with the governor, the 3 election board members were alleged to have violated Georgia's Open Meetings Act, which I mentioned before. And that is actually a violation that carries criminal penalties. So if the governor will not act under the law granting him the authority to hold a hearing on these election board members' misconduct, then, potentially criminal action could follow.
But again, who decides that? Is Chris Carr going to prosecute the members of the state election board for violating the Open Meetings Act?
But who knows? It's just a weird kind of in between space to be in right now.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely something to pay attention to. And clearly there's a lot going on behind the scenes here that a lot of people are not privy to as far as what the actual game plan here is. Okay, let's talk a little bit about voter purges. Just sort of give me your big broad overview of what's happening in Georgia and elsewhere right now and what you guys are working on.
Yeah, so Georgia is a state that allows anyone to essentially file a challenge to another resident's eligibility to vote. It's very odd, but as far as I know, it's been permissible under state law for a while now. But SB 202 and SB 189 both passed after Trump lost the 2020 election here. Legislation inspired by Trump's law, so kind of inspired by a lot of reforms election deniers want to see. They made it even easier to file these complaints. And so now people can file an unlimited number of challenges to people that live in the same county as them, their eligibility to vote. And so, there's really no one place to find all these challenges. It's county by county. And with 159 counties, it's very difficult to keep track. Yep. And so one thing Fair Fight does is we try to monitor these attempts to purge Georgia voters from the rolls when we can, where we can, and we seek to educate folks on what to do if they are removed. Yeah. Like I mentioned before, Peaches, the chatbot, the voter assistant that we made, completely nonpartisan, only trained on actual, factual, correct information. But Peaches can actually help you if you are challenged. Peaches can tell you exactly what to do to remedy the situation. If
you've been deemed inactive, right?
Yes.
People get inactive, yes. Right? Okay.
Yeah. So in a state like Georgia, where the 2020 election was decided on just under 12,000 votes, it seems like the strategy is if you can cut down on just enough folks who are actually able to vote. So, 159 counties. If you did, 100, if you were able to get 100 voters removed per county that Republicans think would not vote for them, that really could help them turn the tide in a close election.
Why are the voters that they are targeting to be removed from the rolls? What evidence do we have that these are voters who are potentially more on the Democratic side?
So it's strange this year. So we've seen smaller numbers of challenges filed across the state than we have before. But a lot of these challenges are, like in the past, seem to be more targeted towards young voters, Black voters, brown voters, as well as unhoused folks, all people who are just demographically more likely to vote for Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah, and the unhoused issue is something that is brought up in the New Georgia Project lawsuit that they filed in July, where it's over 1,000. They are alleging that 1,000 people who have been removed from rolls by like 6 counties where it occurred illegally for a variety of reasons why they say it's illegal. And of course, the RNC has filed a motion to intervene in that lawsuit, basically coming to the defense of these counties for removing anyway. And that New Georgia Project lawsuit, it alleges that like probably a good amount of these people are unhoused people because the people who were removed, the counties did so because they had things like a UPS store as their address, or a post office as their address, which, election deniers will say, well, who's got a post office as their address or a UPS store? Well, homeless people do, right? Because they need somewhere to be able to get their mail, including their voter registration information, right? And so it's not a crime to be homeless. You're allowed to vote if you're homeless. So I just wanted to point that out about why it is that potentially some of these people are unhoused people. And, I'd also like to sort of touch on this 90-day window of the NVRA, which is also mentioned in that New Georgia Project lawsuit, because a lot of these purges of people off voter rolls occurred within 90 days of an election. And the National Voter Registration Act has a prohibition on mass voter challenges and other prohibitions related to election rules and laws and procedures that cannot take place within 90 days of an election. So the New Georgia Project lawsuit says, this many people got removed from the rolls in Chatham County before the March presidential preference primary or whatever. And, so we've also seen recently, not just in Georgia, but elsewhere, North Carolina is a big one last week, where the RNC and other big Democrat or Republican groups are filing lawsuits trying to uphold these mass voter challenges. And of course, we're within 90 days of the election. I'm wondering if you have a thought on why it is that they are potentially doing that and filing lawsuits that look to me like they're probably going to get thrown out pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, to take a quick step back, the NVRA actually does provide ways to remove voters within 90 days. There are certain specific exceptions, but those exceptions are very rare, very few and far between. But it seems like there's a recent lawsuit filed here in Georgia. A group called Citizen AG filed it on behalf of Jason Frazier, who is a prolific voter challenger here in the state of Georgia.
Who was also being floated. I just want to add, he was also being floated to be a Republican member of the SEB at some point by Republican.
Oh, not even floated. They tried to get him on.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and they actually sued when he wasn't added. They later dropped the suit, but they wanted him on there. But he has filed over 10,000 challenges to folks' eligibility to vote in his county, which is Fulton County.
Yeah.
And this lawsuit, it doesn't actually seem like one that is meant to succeed.
When did
I'm
they
not an
file
attorney,
it?
but I've talked to attorneys about this.
When did they file it?
I believe it was just before Labor Day.
Right.
So it's maybe filed, like the week before Labor Day.
And I think the 90-day clock started like August 8th or something like that.
August 7th.
Right. Okay, so Jason Frazier, a prolific election denier activist, a former candidate for the state election board, he's basically telling Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is, you have to remove how many voters from your rolls?
Well, I'm not sure if these were filed at once or collectively, but he himself has filed over 10,000 challenges.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And so I know you had mentioned something about like maybe there's some allusion to why this lawsuit has been filed when it has, and that maybe it's going to get thrown out, but maybe even that's a good thing for the Jason Fraziers of the world, right?
Yeah. So, in addition to some of these challenges to voters that they're filing, the lawsuit almost seems like a way to seed the ground for claims of election fraud that will undoubtedly come in November.
Yeah.
So if you look at the voter challenges, the voter purge attempts across the state, a lot of them are not being upheld, and they continue to be filed, and a lot of them, again, not being upheld, which means they're not actually removing all the voters from the rolls they want.
Right.
And on that front, a lot of the voters that they flagged for these counties are actually being removed by the counties just in normal list maintenance. A lot of folks move to different states. They move to Florida, they move to North Carolina, but those folks are removed from the rolls under normal list maintenance.
Right.
So a lot of times the people they're flagging are already being removed.
Right.
But back to what we were saying. A lot of these mass voter challenges don't actually appear to want to be successful in removing folks from the rolls. It's my opinion and some other folks in this space that what we're seeing are breadcrumbs being laid as evidence or as claims to back up cries of fraud in November.
Right.
So when/if Donald Trump does not win Georgia, they can say, look at all these votes we told you were not legitimate. You didn't let us remove these. There's a lot of fraud. The election is illegitimate.
Right. There's a lot of fraud. People who shouldn't have voted. Undocumented immigrants could have voted. And along the lines of those breadcrumbs, I just want to point out something that I heard this morning that I think alludes to some of this. Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor, was on Meet the Press. I don't know. I'm sure he's being thought of for some sort of cabinet position within a second Trump administration or something like that. I just want to point out he has very odd, off-putting eyebrows. I don't know why, but they just they weird me out. Anyway, he said this morning, we've got states that are just now cleaning up their voter rolls, which is not true, because as you noted, counties are constantly doing list maintenance work to make sure that people who no longer live there are off of there. Challenges are constantly happening in Georgia and elsewhere to make sure that felons aren't on it. But Doug Burgum on Meet the Press, This is like the big thing. You got to go on Meet the Press on Sunday morning and talk about all your policy chops and stuff like that. And here's this guy talking about this storyline, this narrative of, well, there's all these voter rolls that need cleaned up. It's the same narrative in the Jason Frazier lawsuit. It's the same narrative that the RNC is defending in the New Georgia Project lawsuit. It's the same narrative that Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, employed when he raided the homes of Latino voting rights advocates. So, like, I think you're right that what we're seeing is like, yeah, laying the groundwork for a claim that this thing was stolen by ineligible voters. I also just want to point out something else that I picked up in the Sunday Times today: the illegal immigrant thing. Brad Raffensperger in 2022 said they found like 1,650 illegal immigrants that year who were registered to vote, and none of them had actually cast ballots. So that's the other plank of this narrative that I think is emerging right now. There's a bunch of ineligible voters who are going to steal the election, and probably a bunch of them are undocumented immigrants, right?
And that fits real quick. That fits with some of the other disinformation that we're seeing run rampant, right? These stories about, migrants taking over apartment buildings by force that are completely fabricated.
Yeah.
What they're trying to do is demonize the other, right? Yeah. And they're trying to mesh the issues of that with voter fraud together to just sow doubt, create chaos, and really just confuse people.
Right. Which is, to bring it back to the SEB, I mean, yes, the rules that they have passed are problematic in terms of the certification process of results, but potentially the larger harm and the longer lasting harm is that you've got three people up there who are government officials, public officials, who are propagating false claims of widespread voter fraud. Where does all of this end? Where does it go from here? Wrap this up for us in a way where we can understand, potentially, I don't want your predictions on what's going to happen in November, but, if you can give us a sense of like what you guys are working on to make sure that people are not disenfranchised from voting, and what your thoughts are on all of this infighting over election denialism that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing we're trying to do is sound the alarm and make sure voters are educated about what's happening. And we're doing that through a variety of ways. One, we're actually going to be launching a paid ad campaign, direct to voter contact. Make sure you're registered, check your registration,
yep.
And, encourage your friends and family to do the same.
Yeah.
Because we know when we turn out like we did in 2020, we win, right? We can fight back against the election deniers. We can cut through the noise, and, the legitimate voters will show up and make their voices heard, regardless of whether or not they are called illegitimate.
Right.
Trump knows a margin as small as 11,780 votes can make all the difference, especially in states here like Georgia. So, what do his MAGA allies want to do? They want to, remove as many people from the rolls as they can. And if they are not successful doing that, they want to use their failed attempts to sow doubt so they can challenge results in November. We've seen this before. They have done it, but we can win again if we turn out. And, what we're doing at Fair Fight, what we continue to do is just call this out, and we will fight tooth and nail against these attempts to block access to the ballot.
Okay, great. Thank you, Max. I appreciate it. Where is the best place for people to find your work and Fair Fight's work and make sure that, that they're not being removed and things like that? Just tell us where people need to go to stay abreast of all these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to see more about Fair Fight, you can go to fairfight.com. On social media, the tag is Fair Fight Action. And then if you want to engage with Peaches, the AI voter assistant, and get, nonpartisan, correct voting information, you can head to peachvote.com. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little button you can hit, and you can chat with Peaches.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, man. We'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to American Doom. This podcast is just a part of my work as a writer and journalist. To keep up, or at least to try to, because chaos and speed are the two primary drivers of my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just search for American Doom there, and you'll find the investigations and stories that I cover. Coming up on my newsletter are more dives into election deniers working as local election officials across the country. This is work I've been doing mostly by myself for the last 4 years, and it's not possible without your support. American Doom is the only place that you'll find reporting on local election denier officials. So if you support this effort to protect against threats to democracy, please subscribe to my newsletter, American Doom, on Substack. Thank you.